The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Judge Malcolm Avery stepped behind the bench, his head freshly shaved, his stare locked on the officer who had humiliated him just moments before. "Deputy Tatum," he said coldly, approached the bench. No one in the room was prepared for what came next. Malcolm Avery never wore a tie. Not on the bench, not at home, not even at his swearing-in. He believed a man's voice carried more weight than the knot at his collar, and he'd spent his 34 years making sure nobody could mistake his for anything but steady. He kept his hair neat, locks tied back, short enough to look professional, long enough to remind himself of where he came from. On that humid Tuesday morning, Malcolm walked through the marble atrium of Atlanta's Fulton County Courthouse like he belonged, because he did. The badge clipped to his belt, the judge's robe folded carefully over his arm, the polished shoes that had marched him through too many all-nighters in law school, each detail was deliberate, every piece part of a larger statement. "I earned this." But as he stepped into the secure hallway behind the courtroom, a corridor lined with gray doors and the faint scent of coffee gone cold, something was off. Two deputies he didn't recognize, one young and bored, one older, with the kind of weathered face that looked carved from years of suspicion, stood near the holding cells. The older one, Deputy Ryan Tatum, scanned Malcolm up and down, lips pressed in a hard line. "You here for arraignment?" Tatum's voice was loud enough to echo against cinder-block walls. "No," Malcolm replied, matching his volume but not his energy, "I'm here to work. I'm Judge Avery." Tatum's eyes flicked to the badge, then back to Malcolm's face. He didn't move. "Court's not open yet." "Step this way." Malcolm's instincts prickled, something wasn't right, but his father had always told him, never give them an excuse. He complied, moving toward the cell block. The younger deputy leaned over and said something Malcolm couldn't catch, but Tatum's response was clear enough, just follow protocol. That's how it always started, just protocol. Before Malcolm could protest again, Tatum blocked his path. "Before you go anywhere, remove your cap." The words were flat, official. Practiced. Malcolm's pulse ticked up a notch. "Excuse me?" Tatum gestured at Malcolm's head. "That cap. You need to take it off for security." For a second, Malcolm wondered if he was being tested. But no, he'd seen this before. He straightened his posture. "These are my locks. It's not a cap." Tatum's gaze hardened, as if Malcolm had insulted him. "Sir, I won't ask again." Malcolm could feel the younger deputy shift uneasily. "They're my hair," Malcolm said, steady. "It's how I wear it." The moment hung between them. Tatum's jaw flexed, and he exhaled, one of those long, exasperated breaths that signal a decision's already been made. "You want to do this the easy way or the hard way?" Before Malcolm could answer, Tatum barked an order, "Jenkins, open up the cabinet." The younger deputy, Jenkins, fumbled with a key and unlocked a metal drawer by the sink. Out came a pair of electric clippers, old and loud. Tatum held them up, thumb hovering over the switch. "This isn't necessary," Malcolm said, his voice calm but sharp. He could feel anger crawling up his spine, but he kept it pressed down, channeling it into his words. "I'm not a defendant." But Tatum wasn't listening. "If you want to see the judge today, you're getting cleaned up. Otherwise, you can sit in holding." The clippers whirred to life with a grating buzz. Malcolm looked at Jenkins, young, uncertain, but the kid just looked away, pretending to read a clipboard. Tatum stepped closer. "Last chance." The hum of the clippers filled the cell. Malcolm could have fought, shouted, made a scene. But he'd learned early that men like Tatum didn't see black skin and authority in the same frame. He swallowed, locked eyes with Tatum, and didn't flinch. "Go ahead," he said, voice quiet. "But remember who's responsible." Tatum's lips twitched in a smirk as he pressed the clippers into Malcolm's hair. The first pass was clumsy, almost punitive, blades ripping through 6 years of careful growth, through stories. Braided in every lock. The cold metal burned against Malcolm's scalp, but he kept his face blank, refusing to give Tatum the satisfaction of a wince. The clippers snagged, pulled, and hair tumbled to the linoleum in dark clumps. Jenkins watched, horrified, but still said nothing. By the time Tatum was done, Malcolm's head was raw and patchy, the skin red from friction. Tatum stepped back, surveying his work like a man who'd finally conquered an unruly lawn. "Now you look like someone who belongs in a courtroom," he said, tossing the clippers onto the counter. Malcolm stood, brushing stray hair from his shoulders. He felt exposed, but not broken. If anything, his resolve hardened. Tatum gestured to the tiny mirror above the sink. "You're welcome." Malcolm didn't look. He met Tatum's eyes, steady and unbowed. "Are we finished?" Tatum's smugness flickered for a split second. "You'll be called in a few minutes. Don't say I never did you a favor." As Jenkins led him down the hall toward the courtroom, Malcolm's mind buzzed, not with anger, but with calculation. Every step echoed with the weight of 1,000 stories just like this one. But none of them ended the way his would. The double doors to courtroom 2B swung open. Lawyers, clerks, and a scattering of defendants and family members filled the benches. The energy changed the instant Malcolm entered. He didn't turn toward the defendant's table, he walked straight to the bench. The bailiff glanced up, confusion clouding his face as Malcolm set his briefcase on the bench and shrugged on his judge's robe, the motion slow and deliberate. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Jenkins ducked out, face pale. Tatum, stationed near the back, went rigid as recognition dawned. Malcolm called the courtroom to order, his voice unshaken. "Good morning. Before we proceed, I need Deputy Tatum to approach the bench." The room froze. Tatum looked around, as if searching for backup, but found only eyes, clerk, bailiff. Attorneys, all watching. He moved to the front, each step heavier than the last. Malcolm waited until the room was silent enough that he could hear the distant whine of a copier down the hall. "Deputy Tatum, can you explain your conduct in holding this morning?" Tatum opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence pressed in. Malcolm spoke for everyone to hear, his tone neither loud nor soft, but freighted with authority. "You decided, based solely on how I wore my hair, that I didn't belong here. You made a choice. Not out of necessity, not out of safety, but out of bias." Tatum's face colored. Malcolm continued, voice growing firmer. "You didn't ask my name. You didn't look at my credentials. You saw locks and saw a threat. So you decided to humiliate me, to strip me of something that, for you, was just an inconvenience, but for me, is a piece of my family, my father, my story." The gallery was silent. Even the bailiff had stopped typing. "Let me be clear," Malcolm said, gaze unblinking. "You took my hair, but you didn't take my authority." He nodded to the bailiff. "Call internal affairs. Deputy Tatum will remain here until they arrive." The bailiff, wide-eyed, picked up the phone. Tatum's mouth opened and closed, but he didn't protest. He looked smaller than he had all morning. The attorneys at their tables watched in stunned silence, some with jaws slack, others with barely concealed relief. For the next 30 minutes, Malcolm ran the docket as if nothing had happened, voice measured, decisions fair, even as his scalp stung beneath the judge's cap. When internal affairs officers arrived, Tatum was led from the courtroom, his face pale and jaw clenched. Malcolm didn't watch him go. He finished the calendar, adjourned, and finally allowed himself a deep, steadying breath. Outside, the city moved on. But inside the courthouse, everyone who'd witnessed that morning knew something fundamental had changed. Malcolm Avery wasn't just another black man in a suit, he was the judge. And for the first time, the system had been forced to see it. The courtroom was still humming with the aftershock when Malcolm Avery stepped back into chambers, his fingers lightly grazing the back of his head. The skin was still tender, raw from the clippers, but he wasn't thinking about the physical sting. What stayed with him was the silence, the charged, breathless hush that settled over the room the moment he'd taken the bench. For a second, he thought about what would have happened if he hadn't said anything. If he'd let that humiliation sit there, unaddressed, like just another scar tucked beneath a robe. But that wasn't who he was. Not anymore. By noon, the story had already started its journey. A clerk with fast fingers had typed a thread online before court even recessed. Judge enters courtroom after being shaved bald by officer who thought he was a defendant. Room froze. You had to be there. Someone else uploaded a clip from their phone, grainy footage, but clear enough to capture his voice, that final line echoing like a gavel, "You took my hair, but not my authority." Within hours, the local news had picked it up. By evening, it was on national feeds. Malcolm didn't have social media. He never trusted the noise. But when his phone wouldn't stop vibrating on his nightstand, when friends he hadn't heard from in years started texting words like proud and damn, he knew the storm had landed. By the next morning, there were protesters on the courthouse steps. Some held signs, "Respect our crowns," "Judges wear locks too," and "Hair is not equal to threat." Others simply stood in quiet solidarity, fists raised. But not everyone saw it that way. The courthouse administration, tight-lipped and visibly shaken by the national attention, called Malcolm into a closed-door meeting. No cameras. No press. Just 3 pale-faced executives and a request dressed up like a favor. Judge Avery, the administrator, began, smoothing the creases of his tie like they were more important than the words coming out of his mouth, in light of recent events and the media attention. "We believe it would be prudent, purely temporary, for you to take a brief administrative leave." Malcolm leaned forward, elbows resting on the edge of the polished table, voice calm but firm. "To protect whom?" They shifted. Cleared their throats. "We just want to give things time to settle. This has become complicated." Malcolm stared at them. "It's only complicated because someone made it so. Not me." The room went quiet. They didn't push further, but the message was clear. He walked out without a handshake. The next morning, he was back on the bench, bald head shining beneath the courtroom lights, posture straighter than ever. The silence that greeted him this time was different. Not shock. Respect. Even those who weren't sure what to make of the headlines couldn't deny it now. He was still standing. Still commanding the room. Still every bit the judge. That afternoon, a quiet message arrived in his inbox from a friend in the State Judicial Review Board. A heads up. "Malcolm, they're preparing an inquiry. They're going to say you shouldn't have presided over your own docket. Conflict of interest." Malcolm sat back in his chair, the irony bitter on his tongue. They weren't coming for Tatum. They weren't investigating how a judge ended up in a holding cell getting his identity shaved from his scalp. They were coming for him, for not staying quiet. For making them look too closely at what was hiding in plain sight. He didn't respond to the message. Instead, he got in his car and drove south, down I-85, to a town hall in South Atlanta. He hadn't been invited. But when he arrived, people made room. The panel discussion was already in motion: organizers, local activists, lawyers. Talk of bail reform. Of community policing. Of broken systems dressed in robes and badges. And then a voice called from the back, "Let Judge Avery speak." It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. But it didn't need to be. He stepped to the mic in a room packed with tension and grief and people tired of pretending. He didn't start with a speech. He started with a question. "How many of you," he asked, scanning the faces, "have been mistaken for less than who you are?" A sea of hands rose. And he nodded. "This isn't about a haircut," he continued, voice low but deliberate. "This is about the belief that respect comes dressed a certain way. That dignity has to look like them to be recognized by them." The room leaned in. "I didn't say anything in that holding cell, not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted them to finish. I wanted them to see exactly what they were doing, uninterrupted. Because you can't fix what you're unwilling to witness. They saw my skin and decided I couldn't possibly belong in the seat I earned. So they shaved my history. And then I sat down at the bench anyway." Applause rippled through the crowd, quiet at first, then building, strong and full of something deeper than approval. It was recognition. That speech didn't end with applause. It ended with commitment. "I'm not leaving," he said. And I'm not shaving down who I am to make the system more comfortable. By midnight, clips from the town hall had gone viral. News anchors were calling him the judge who turned silence into justice. Commentators argued both sides. One network called him a principled disruptor. Another called him a provocateur hiding behind the bench. But no matter what angle they chose, one thing was clear: Malcolm Avery wasn't just a local judge anymore. He was a symbol. And symbols don't retreat. Days later, the inquiry letter arrived, signed, sealed, and full of veiled language about procedure and professionalism. But the public saw through it. A petition in support of Malcolm gathered over 100,000 signatures in 48 hours. Law students began citing him in lectures. Civil rights groups issued statements. Even a few fellow judges, long silent on such issues, cautiously voiced support. Still, the pressure grew. Emails poured in. Threats. Praise. Warnings. Opportunities. Every time he walked through the courthouse doors, the air changed. Some nodded in respect. Some looked away. But no one ignored him. His mentors, once hopeful he'd rise through the system unscathed, now called with caution in their voices. They're not used to someone like you taking up this much space, Malcolm. They're going to keep pushing until you make a mistake. But Malcolm already knew. This wasn't about mistakes. It was about making him smaller. About making him quiet. And that wasn't going to happen. He'd already been shaved down to the skin. There was nothing left to strip but the truth, and he was just getting started. The morning after his town hall speech, Malcolm Avery woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating nonstop on the nightstand. Missed calls, news alerts, texts from former students and retired judges alike. His inbox was flooded with links, news anchors dissecting his words, think pieces titled "The Judge Who Refused to Shave Down for the System." He didn't need to open them to know what they said. The buzz wasn't just national, it was surgical, precise, and building. And so was the blowback. While his words ignited solidarity from communities across the country, they also stirred up the storm waiting in the shadows. By noon, an anonymous memo began circulating among legislators, a quiet recommendation suggesting Judge Malcolm Avery be reviewed for judicial fitness. The language was polished, respectful, almost sterile. Concerns regarding temperament, objectivity, and courtroom decorum. But Malcolm had read enough of these documents in his career to know exactly what it meant. They weren't questioning his rulings, they were questioning his place. He was making them uncomfortable. And that was enough. That same day, a reporter from WNN, a major network, called his office. "We'd like to do a one-on-one special with Judge Avery," the producer said. "A long-form feature. National prime time. You'll have editorial input." Malcolm listened silently, letting the offer hang in the air. 3 months ago, they wouldn't have looked at him twice. Now, they wanted to spotlight him, not for the cases he'd ruled on, not for the reforms he quietly helped implement, but because his story sold headlines. Still, he said yes. Not for attention. Not for image. But because if the system was going to shine a spotlight, he was going to control the narrative. The interview was set for a Friday evening, filmed live in an intimate studio in Midtown. When the host welcomed him with a handshake and a stiff smile, Malcolm could already sense the script they hoped he'd follow. Humble. Reflective. Apologetic. But he didn't give them what they wanted. He gave them the truth. "They didn't try to just humiliate me," he said evenly, facing the camera. "They tried to erase me. But they didn't understand something important. I'm not here because someone allowed me to be. I'm here because I built myself into someone they couldn't ignore." The clip exploded within minutes of broadcast. One line in particular echoed across TikTok, Twitter, and late-night segments alike. "They tried to silence me with clippers." But resilience isn't how you endure in silence, it's how you speak when your voice shakes the room. The next day, that quote was printed on protest signs across 5 cities. By Sunday, a mural in downtown Atlanta was painted, Malcolm, bald-headed, eyes lifted, robe sweeping behind him like a flag. But while the public raised their fists, the system sharpened its knives. Hate mail found its way to his office. Security was increased. Threats rang in through courthouse phone lines, voicemail after voicemail laced with venom, with code words and dog whistles pretending to be patriotism. "You made the bench political," one message sneered. "You people always do." One morning, his clerk slid a letter across his desk, face tight. The return address was a state senator's office. Inside was a statement, carefully worded, almost benign, raising legitimate concern about Malcolm's ability to remain impartial given the heightened personal attention surrounding his story. He read the letter twice, then filed it in a drawer and kept reading motions for the day's hearings. They weren't going to scare him off the bench with stationery. That week, Malcolm was invited to speak at the Southeastern Summit on Legal Equity, a gathering of professors, judges, law students, and public defenders. The theme was building resilience in the next generation. When he took the stage, he didn't open with a quote or statistics. He opened with a pause. A long one. He let the silence stretch until the room grew still. Then he said, "They thought shaving my head would cut away the part of me that made them uncomfortable. But they didn't realize my strength isn't worn. It's lived." He spoke of courtrooms where fairness is worn like a costume. Of police departments where bias is called protocol. Of systems that let prejudice slip through legal cracks like water through marble. But he didn't preach. He revealed. He didn't condemn. He challenged. And when he ended, it wasn't with a call for sympathy. It was a call for courage. They will call you angry when you speak. They will call you biased when you question bias. And when you win, they will say you didn't do it the right way. But your silence won't protect your seat. It'll only protect their comfort. The room stood with him. It wasn't applause, it was thunder. That night, Malcolm drove home in silence. No music. No phone calls. Just the quiet understanding that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and didn't want to. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Board met in closed session. The motion to formally investigate his conduct didn't pass, but only by a single vote. It wasn't vindication. It was a warning. He stayed. Unbent. Undeterred. He kept presiding over cases. He kept signing off on motions. He kept showing up, head still bare, voice still clear. Not to prove he belonged, but to remind them that he never left. And through it all, the pressure never broke him. Because Malcolm Avery had long understood what his ancestors had known before him, that the fight for justice isn't measured by court rulings or Senate votes. It's measured by the days you stand when everything around you tries to make you sit. In an interview 6 months later, a journalist asked him what kept him going. "I didn't do it to be brave," he replied. "I did it because I remembered who I was before the robe. And I remembered who they tried to make me forget." When the interviewer asked if he feared losing his position, Malcolm just smiled. "This was never about keeping a job," he said. "It's about exposing a culture that only respects power when it looks familiar." That quote would become the final line of a best-selling memoir. But Malcolm didn't write it for the book deal. He wrote it for the next young attorney who walks into a courtroom wearing locks, shoulders straight, name doubted before they speak. Because this wasn't just his story. It was a mirror. And he made sure it would reflect forever. As the author of this story, I want to leave you with something deeper than just a headline or a courtroom victory. Malcolm Avery's journey isn't just a tale of injustice, it's a mirror reflecting the quiet battles many people face each day, simply for existing in spaces where others believe they don't belong. His story is about what happens when dignity is challenged, and what strength looks like when you choose not to break. Too often, systems built to deliver justice can also be the ones that reinforce silence. Malcolm didn't stay silent. He didn't raise his voice in anger, but he raised it with purpose. And in doing so, he reminded us that power isn't just in titles or robes, it's in knowing your worth even when others try to strip it from you. Let this story be a reminder that resilience is not passive. It's not about gritting your teeth and enduring pain quietly. True resilience is speaking when your voice trembles, standing when you've been told to sit, and showing up even after you've been wronged. It's choosing not to let someone else's perception rewrite your truth. We live in a world where bias often wears a badge or holds a gavel. But that doesn't mean we stop pushing for better. Whether you're a young law student entering a courtroom for the first time, or someone who's been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, this story is for you. Don't let anyone tell you that you have to change who you are to be taken seriously. What makes you different may just be what makes you powerful. And to those watching, reading, and reflecting, I hope you see not just the injustice, but the endurance. I hope you walk away not just angry, but awakened. From all of us here at U.S. Instructive Stories, thank you for joining us on this powerful journey. If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Let it open doors to conversations that matter. Because real change doesn't begin in silence, it begins when we dare to speak. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and never let the world cut away what makes you whole.